A U.S. carrier strike group looms off the coast of Ireland, launching a fresh wave of fighters into the sky. Carrier Strike Group Zeta moves swiftly to support Carrier Strike Group Charlie, locked in a fierce battle 200 miles to the south. Over the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the fight for air superiority is underway. F-18 Super Hornets and F-35 streak through the clouds, clashing with the French and British Eurofighters in a battle no one ever thought possible. This is World War III. And the country that started it and who will be fighting who isn't who or this channel ever thought it would be. Greenland. Technically, Greenland is not a country. It's an autonomous territory belonging to Denmark, but maybe starting World War III and plunging the modern world into chaos earns you an upgrade. Well, as long as it can stay independent from the United States. It started as what most assumed, with nothing more than a hyperbolic comment from the US president. The US needed Greenland. Historically and geographically speaking, the White House is correct, the US does need Greenland. And that's why Denmark has allowed America to station everything from aircraft to over-the-horizon radars there. Greenland's position at the top of the world makes it the perfect spot for early warning systems, interceptors, and long-range bombers. They all act as a deterrent against the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation from launching a surprise nuclear attack. It's easier and it's faster for Russia to launch a nuclear attack on the US over the North Pole rather than to go the long way around laterally. This reduces an ICBM's flight time from hours to around 30 minutes or less depending on the target. If nuclear bombers were launched from the Soviet or Russian territory, they could breach US airspace in under 3 hours. Once in range, they would be capable of launching long-range cruise missiles at targets across the continental US, striking anywhere from an hour to 2 hours later. That window tightens even further if the bomber isn't planning on returning home, and it flies at top speed without any regard for fuel efficiency. Allowing the US to monitor the North Pole approach from Greenland isn't just in America's interest, it's vital for Europe too. That northern route is remote, vast, and difficult to monitor, making it a prime path for a surprise attack. This is why Denmark has allowed the US to base forces there since the end of the Second World War. But that is not enough anymore, because one key piece of the Greenland puzzle has changed, and it's definitely not what you're thinking. Greenland is, outside of Antarctica, one of the largest nearly virgin sources of natural resources on the planet. And thanks to global warming, those deposits are finally starting to be accessible. Technically, they were always accessible, but the cost of operations in so much ice and snow was prohibitive when minerals could be extracted much cheaper elsewhere. The White House is eyeing those vast deposits of rare earth elements, uranium, iron, zinc, lead, gold, and platinum that global warming will soon expose for extraction. Then there is huge deposits of oil and gas just sitting off the shore, at the moment blocked by extreme weather and Danish environmental protections. Since the 1990s, over 11,000 square miles of Greenland's ice sheet has melted, allowing vegetation to creep in. This has created what's being called a pending mineral gold rush, with companies around the world chomping at the bit to go after one of the largest untapped sources of mineral wealth on the planet. And suddenly, it makes perfect sense why the White House wants Greenland to become the latest state. The problem is, Greenland isn't for sale, and Greenlanders themselves have absolutely zero desire to become a part of the US. Despite the US president claiming that Greenlanders want to be Americans, polls show that 85% of residents have zero desire to fly the Stars and Stripes. It's becoming a bit of an international problem, because while everyone assumed the White House was simply talking hyperbolic about having Greenland one way or another, it turns out the administration wasn't. The president has repeatedly stated that he is willing to use force to take Greenland, and when pressed on the matter, refused to take back those threats of force. But the party being militarily threatened with invasion here is Denmark, one of the US's oldest allies and a signatory member of NATO. That makes the Greenland fiasco a bit of a global war tripwire. While the United States was once seen as Europe's closest partner and ally, in a few short months America has become a military threat to the continent. Plenty of Americans and Europeans have no desire to fight each other, and it's a nightmare to even consider the logistics of such a war. But that doesn't mean a war isn't possible. In fact, Europe's weakness without the United States makes war more likely, not less. With America increasingly backing Russia over Ukraine and distancing itself from Europe, the European Union and Britain are facing a political crisis. Russia is unlikely to be satisfied with taking whatever part of Ukraine the US decides it's earned. And as most defense analysts predict, the nation will simply spend the next few years rearming itself and preparing to take the fight deeper into Europe. Vladimir Putin's goal is nothing less than the restoration of the Soviet world. An attack on the eastern members of Europe wouldn't just be a military crisis, it would ignite a political firestorm for the EU and Britain alike. If Europe failed to respond immediately and decisively, the credibility of its mutual defense promise would crumble. Just like with NATO, if one member is attacked and the rest do nothing, the entire alliance structure begins to collapse. The promise of protection no longer holds any weight. This would fragment Europe and make the entire world a lot less safe. While it's clear that the US military currently outclasses all of Europe's military, the EU would have no option but to respond to a US occupation of Greenland with force. Further, this would trigger an Article 5 emergency for NATO, and the European members of NATO and Canada face the same problem as the EU. If they don't live up to the promise of mutual defense, then the alliance falls apart. There's no choice but to fight, even if Europe lacks the logistics to even get troops or aircraft to Greenland in numbers. That doesn't mean that it would be a cakewalk for the US. For starters, the United States would immediately become an international pariah state on the level of Russia. No matter how the Greenland situation played out, the nation would be tainted for decades, perhaps even centuries, as a traitor. No nation would make the mistake of accepting any political alliances with the US. Despite the confidence many Americans have in their nation's unmatched power, the reality is more complex. Without the global network of partners and allies the US relies on, American firepower doesn't project far beyond its own shores. The US is a global power because it has global friends, giving it global reach. Losing those friends would make the United States nothing more than a regional power once more. The next nation that could start World War III is a lot closer to home and in a much more precarious position than it might realize. Canada. 6 months ago, if you were to take a global survey on what nations would likely start World War III, Canada would be somewhere around the bottom of the list, if not the bottom. The nation enjoys a globally good reputation. So what makes Canada the likely culprit for World War III? Well, the White House administration has expressed an interest in gaining new stars on the old red, white, and blue, and this time the reasons are more complicated than with Greenland. Once more, the world assumed that it was typical hyperbole, but the American president has made it clear once again it absolutely isn't. Internal polling shows that 80% of Canadians have no desire to join their North American neighbor. In protest to what they see as threats to their sovereignty, many Canadians have enacted self-boycotts of U.S. goods and even canceled trips to the U.S. Local and regional governments have even organized boycotts of American goods and services. Traffic from Canada to the U.S. dropped by a whopping 20% in just 1 month. This represented a loss of millions of dollars in tourist income for communities along the border which rely heavily on Canadians. One Canadian couple interviewed by the Boston Globe put it best, "We're stunned by what's going on in the United States. We thought that the States were always our friend, and now it's a big surprise. No, they're not." But things could go from simmering to boiling in an instant, and once more spark a global war. Canada is not a part of the EU, but it is a part of NATO. The United States may have officially undersigned NATO military for most of its history, but the alliance still has a strong interest in remaining credible even if the US leaves, or if the US becomes a threat to NATO itself, which looks increasingly plausible. It doesn't matter if the aggressor is Russia and thus in Europe's backyard, or America, where Canada sits as a sole NATO member facing off against the US across a land border. NATO would still have to respond militarily to a US incursion into Canada. And while Greenland could be taken without violence by dropping off a few thousand troops before anyone could respond, Canada is not so easily taken. In fact, Canada could put up enough of a fight to make the US regret its decision. The Canadian military is only 100,000 strong versus a US military peaking over 1 million. The nation only has 70 or so tanks and 616 infantry fighting vehicles, but a fight for Canada would not favor the use of armor and heavy vehicles in the way that Ukraine does. With its rugged terrain, the war for Canada would favor the defender, making any incursion by the United States an incredibly bloody one. These aren't terrorists it's facing. It's extremely well-trained soldiers whose commanders graduated from the same military academies as America's, and they have some of the best equipment in the world. The real question is, what could the rest of NATO realistically do? Bringing the fight to the US is a non-starter. The world simply doesn't have the logistical capacity to reach the United States, let alone while under fire from the world's top naval power across thousands of miles of ocean. Sure, the entire rest of the world has more tanks than the US, but just try getting a ship that can actually carry those tanks across the ocean and then disembark them in a full-blown combat zone. It's taken China years to prepare for an invasion of Taiwan, and that's an island literally right off its own coast. But NATO forces could still strike at U.S. bases inside of Europe itself, assuming American forces don't stay behind and become permanently cut off. In the age of globalism, though, the best weapon isn't the latest tank or stealth fighter. It's money. Europe and the U.S. have the world's largest bilateral trade and investment relationship, worth over 1.6 trillion euros in 2023. It's also one of America's most balanced trade relationships, with a trade deficit of only 3% for the U.S. With $375 billion in goods flowing from the U.S. to Europe and $461 billion worth of services, losing the European market would tank the American economy. Unemployment would reach record highs, and the hit to the U.S. GDP would be far more than what it would gain from exploiting Canadian resources. Then there's the cascading effects of sanctions from around the world. It's not as easy for nations to sanction the U.S. as it was to sanction Russia. But if Russian sanctions proved anything, it's that the democratic world stands pretty firmly against aggressors. Losing European trade, along with a significant portion of global trade, would destroy America as a global superpower. China would immediately sail past the U.S. as the most important economic and political power, especially as it would quickly move to fill the hole caused by the sanctioning of American businesses and services, both in Europe and abroad. Even more so than military action, a simple economic blockade would tank America, turning it into a second world power if sanctions persisted for a number of years. And for all its might, the U.S. would immediately be unable to afford its existing military, let alone replenish ongoing losses if it tried to use its might to force Europe into concessions. Then there's the basic problem that the U.S. military equipment is largely not single source. This means that America's top weapons programs all enjoy global contributions, either in materials, components, or even engineering expertise. For example, the F-35 is a global fighter more than it is an American one. Everything from parts of the wings to the VTOL engines for the B model coming from foreign nations. The question everyone's asking themselves is how likely either of our two previous scenarios are. Considering that the free world went from normal to losing the US in a matter of months, the sky's the limit when it comes to global conflict. But our next nation is likely to start World War III without any US involvement at all. It's exactly where you think it is, but it's not the one you're thinking of. Philippines. The Philippines might not top anyone's list of global superpowers or potential Armageddon triggers, but they could be about to throw the entire planet into the most devastating war in history. Specifically, Filipino fishermen, and as usual, it's not even their fault. In October of 2024, a Filipino Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources boat was at sea near Thitu Island when it encountered several Chinese fishing ships. The Chinese vessels, however, were part of China's infamous maritime militia, a shadowy, loosely organized force estimated to number over 1,000 vessels. Not to be confused with the Chinese Coast Guard, which has duties similar to America's Coast Guard. The maritime militia is not a uniformed service, but it is still very much an arm of China's military. It's a force that specializes in what's known as gray zone warfare. Maritime militia vessels are ordinary fishing boats, but are easily spotted because they rarely do any actual fishing. In fact, the Chinese government pays them not to fish. Instead, they act as either intelligence-gathering assets, recon assets, or to intimidate and bully other nations' fishermen and commercial vessels. In the October 2024 encounter, the Chinese maritime militia boat sideswiped the smaller Filipino government boat. If this were a uniformed vessel, it would have been an act of war. But because it was a civilian vessel, China can pretend it was a civilian acting on their own, thus distance itself from the consequences. The problem is, this 1,000-plus fleet of civilian vessels are about to start a global war. China's maritime militia exists for one reason: to bully other nations out of fishing grounds so China can claim sovereignty. Modern China believes that its territorial waters extend across the 9-dash line, a controversial boundary that covers nearly the entire South China Sea. This line pushes deep into the exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, of several neighboring countries, including Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, among others. Despite being ruled as illegal by the International Court at The Hague, China is refusing to back off its 9-dash line claim. This is a serious problem for those neighboring nations, as they're effectively being bullied off of waters worth billions in economic activity, from fishing to resource exploitation. But while China can ram and even sink Vietnamese and Malaysian vessels, whenever its maritime militia attacks a Filipino vessel, it's risking war. And that's because the Philippines are one of America's oldest treaty allies, and the Filipino people are getting pretty tired of being bullied by the Chinese. For 2 decades now, Filipino ships have been attacked at sea, some even sunk, and now the Philippines is asking a very important question of the international community. At what point does a Chinese militia attack constitute an act of war? The question is a poignant one because these attacks aren't just risking the lives of fishermen and even Filipino government employees, they are slowly but surely driving neighbors out of their own legitimate maritime claims. China has successfully driven Filipino fishermen out of many claims, such as those near the Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands, which by international law belongs to the Philippines. Slowly but surely, the Philippines' economy is being affected, as thousands of fishermen lose their livelihoods from losing access to their fishing grounds. And there are lives at stake. In 2019, a Chinese vessel rammed and then sank a Filipino fishing boat while it was sitting at anchor near Reed Bank. The shocking attack resulted in the loss of the boat, with 22 fishermen stranded out in open waters. Instead of rescuing them, per maritime international law and basic decency, the Chinese vessel instead fled the scene and left the Filipinos to drown. Luckily for them, a nearby Vietnamese vessel responded to a mayday in time to rescue the men before they succumbed to exhaustion. With the people of the Philippines already extremely angry at China, the next serious injury or death could prompt an armed response. The Philippine Navy may be outclassed by the Chinese Navy, but it has the backing of the most powerful Navy on the planet. The threat is so serious that in 2024, the Philippines welcomed a massive expansion of U.S. firepower on their islands, with the addition of multiple airfields, facilities, and even missile sites for U.S. troops. And under treaty obligation to defend the Philippines, the next Chinese attack could force America's hand. For its part, China knows this, but it's also been working to undermine the U.S. commitment to its treaty much in the same way Russia is in Europe. By conducting a campaign of incremental acts of aggression, China is in effect daring the U.S. to respond, as it is obligated to by treaty. The last thing the U.S. wants is a war, but if it fails to live up to its treaty obligation when push comes to shove, it'll undermine the entire global order, which is completely underlined by American commitments to enforce freedom of navigation around the planet. The end result of such a collapse of the U.S.-led world order is a return to pre-World War II history, where global powers vie for control and influence, setting the stage for endless conflicts that have been the hallmark of human history prior to World War II. Which country do you think is the most likely to trigger World War III, and why? Drop your theories in the comments below. Now go check out more good news, with France preparing for a nuclear war against Russia, or click this other video instead.